Extortion is not new in South Africa, and unfortunately I like to believe that it was deliberately ignored because many people in senior positions were unfortunately involved in extortion. Now recently we heard of a doctor in Mthatha in the Eastern Cape, Dr. Anele Yoko, who actually had to close an ophthalmology practice because of being forced to pay protection money. And if that doctor didn't pay, they would have killed him. He eventually didn't pay, but that forced him to close the practice. So it's becoming so serious that even medical care will be denied because of these criminals that I like to call tax pirates. The transport sector, we know about the Intercape bus service that face significant pressure from taxi mafias, and there's no other way to explain them, after they actually murdered some of their bus drivers, wounded many, and even attacked some of the people being transported on those buses just because they wanted control of routes between the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape.
Yeah, guys, so I stumbled on an ex-post by Ian Cameron who argued that, these Zama Zamas are not trapped. According to this ex-post, he reads that, he just wants to reiterate that the Zama Zamas in Stilfontein are not trapped. They choose not to exit due to fear of arrest, conviction, and losing whatever they have extracted. And you can hear in this speech, he argues that there's some people, some big people in power who actually might be involved in the whole Zama Zama issue, and that, there's some that even call it to be a form of a business. And so I thought that was really interesting, a really interesting speech. But the fact that the DA has a really interesting systematic procedure to obliterate extortion for South Africa, I think it's actually worthwhile. I think it's worthwhile for us to listen to how the DA plans to end extortion and, especially construction mafia. And extortion is generally in South Africa. I think from Ian Cameron, he actually breaks it down, knowing fully well that he's in the portfolio committee in policing in South Africa, in the parliament, to really break it down. So let's listen quickly to what he has to say about how the DA plans to end extortion in South Africa. And I'll be back for another interesting report that actually argues that the Zama Zamas, who are actually trapped in the ground, have a paramilitary wing, according to the report anyway, that is involved in grain theft, so to speak. But that's another really interesting research. Let's listen to Ian Cameron now. I'll be back quickly.
As I start, I think it's important to give a little bit of context as to what the extortion crisis looks like in South Africa. Now recently, we heard of a doctor in Mthatha in the Eastern Cape, Dr. Anele Yoko, who actually had to close an ophthalmology practice because of being forced to pay protection money. And if that doctor didn't pay, they would have killed him. He eventually didn't pay, but that forced him to close the practice. So it's becoming so serious that even medical care will be denied because of, as Karabo said, these criminals that I like to call tax pirates, because that is exactly what they have become. This is one of many medical practices that have been closed down, and it's just one of the focus areas of these construction, extortion, medical mafias. There's so many we can call them. I think it's critical that we understand that extortion is escalating so fast because of several reasons, and we're going to touch on some of those today. But one of them that's important to understand is that it's really become a very lucrative business opportunity for criminals, because legislation doesn't really ensure any kind of very serious punishment. And even when you are caught, chances of prosecution are extremely low. And I want to give you a few examples. So according to the South African Police Service, between 2019 and 2024, approximately 6,000 extortion cases were reported across the country. Now, those increase almost monthly at the moment, with the Eastern Cape being the worst of all. But then if you look at convictions that came out of those 4 or 5 years worth of reporting, it was less than 7% successful conviction rate. That is extremely low, and it rates almost lower than matters regarding, for example, GBV, murder prosecution, and so on and so forth. And remember, these types of extortion crimes include many other different types of crime. Very often we see charges like defeating the ends of justice, when unfortunately, and it's in the minority, police officers have also involved themselves in this, and often it is done because of intimidation on a local level. In terms of the sectors that are impacted by this, obviously the construction sector, and I think there's no one better than my colleague Diane Kolobana that will speak about that soon, because the construction sector has been numbed in some areas with regards to extortion threats. The transport sector, we know about the Intercape bus service that face significant pressure from taxi mafias, and there's no other way to explain them, after they actually murdered some of their bus drivers, wounded many, and even attacked some of the people being transported on those buses just because they wanted control of routes between the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. We look at municipalities in the Western Cape itself, in the city of Cape Town. People have literally been murdered by members of these extortion mafias because municipalities wouldn't want to give in to paying extortion money to these different organizations. The security sector, we recently saw the underworld figure in Cape Town, or let's say alleged underworld figure, Mark Liffman, that was murdered recently in an assassination, where he himself had many question marks regarding a security company that he was involved in different parts in and around Cape Town with regards to extortion, and how they allegedly forced their way into controlling parts of protection in nightclubs and nightlife industries in and around the city. The mining sector, we already know this, and it's actually come to a point where some people are even advocating for illegal mining to be seen as a normal business proposition. I heard again in the media this morning that it's almost spoken of as something that's just purely curbing poverty, where we know that the violence and the way that communities are terrorized by some of these illegal mining groups has really increased quite dramatically over the years. And then I think the most important is vulnerable communities. I think the perception is often created that it's just rich and wealthy businesses or business people that are impacted. But it's important to acknowledge that very often the poorest of the poor are forced to also pay protection money. Not far from here, in places like Nyanga, Langa, Guguletu, elderly people are sometimes forced to pay extortion or protection money just for having a DSTV dish outside your house, or for having a parking space in front of your house, or having a TV inside your house, which obviously is absolutely unacceptable. Now, the Democratic Alliance takes this extremely seriously, because not only does this encourage a whole list of other crimes, it actually holds our entire economy hostage. And the first crucial intervention that we have proposed, and that I've already seen has influenced policy on a national level, that it's taken very seriously by the police as well, and it's an opportunity, I think, brought to us by the Government of National Unity, is centralized intelligence gathering and analysis. The first part of this intervention that is critical to us is to really capacitate the National Anti-Economical and Extortion Crime Task Team. If we don't have specialized skills in a team like that, and also the right amount of specialized people to fulfill their duties in such a unit, we cannot expect for data to be analyzed in a way to make it into operational intelligence. What do I mean by that? We need to make sure that the information and reports that we get can be verified, and then after that used in order to arrest and then obviously prosecute the relevant people that are involved. We need to make sure that we implement regional anti-extortion units, and with the DA-led City of Cape Town, it is one of the very few local governments that have put such an extortion unit into place, or anti-extortion unit, and we have seen some success. But currently, without the adequate support from the South African Police Service, it does make it difficult to see results. We also believe that this leads to devolution, and I'll share more about that later. But we need to spread the work pressure across the different levels of government, not only to alleviate pressure on the national budget, but this is a critical thing that with crime intelligence, we can actually lessen the burden for national government and make sure that we don't put too much pressure on already underperforming budget. The last 2 or 3 points regarding intelligence is to make sure that we've got a centralized database. Different entities need to speak with each other. It's impossible for us to run this properly if different policing entities, the private sector, and even community structures don't have a way of centralizing information for that to be verified, to make sure that we know what the bigger picture looks like. This will ensure continuous data analysis for us to know what we're dealing with and who we're dealing with. And it will also help us to make sure that we're not only trying to arrest ground level, let's call them foot soldiers, but that we actually are led to arrest and convict the relevant kingpins. After that, and this is the last part of the intelligence component, it's enhancing communication and information sharing. We need to make sure that, for example, the extortion hotlines aren't only there to report complaints, but that feeds into a system where information can be verified and built into operational intelligence, something that can be used in a network that can be shared with the relevant authorities in order to take on the relevant issues. The second part of the DA's policy specifically focused on enhanced community reporting and support mechanisms. Now, this plugs in to the intelligence part and sometimes might not be seen as intelligence, but I think is a vital building block for solid intelligence structures. The first part of this intervention is capacitating and enhancing the National Anti-Extortion Hotline. Actually, we spoke about this in the police committee yesterday. And it's critical for us that there's a centralized place, as I said just now, where all of this information feeds into in order to be able to follow up. Now, so far, there is an increase in people reporting it, and it does seem that South Africans are becoming more comfortable with using these hotlines. The challenge that we have is to make sure that it is followed up on a local level and that the relevant people are held to account when it comes to actually following up the cases. There's no use in having a hotline that isn't actually used to see some kind of an operational success. We need to make sure that we've got the relevant community partnerships. Something that's important about this is that we don't just see, for example, from a parliamentary point of view, that we will have some kind of a public engagement or hearing where people might actually put themselves at risk. So we need to make sure that we've got the relevant partnerships with community policing forums, neighborhood watches, other entities, churches, schools, etc., in order to get the relevant information and build it into this communication structure, which again will lead to the building block of combating this, which is intelligence-led policing. Training community liaison officers, critical, but once again, we need to make sure that we protect them. We can't expect community liaison officers to take this risk and to speak out because it's as simple as them really being assassinated. As I said about the ophthalmologist earlier, it's one of thousands of examples where people receive death threats, and unfortunately, and especially in poorer communities, it seems that those threats aren't always taken as seriously, and we cannot sit or be in a situation where someone's life counts less because of the circumstances in which they live. And then the last part of the community part of the policy is providing victim support and protection. And this is something that must be done in cooperation with the MPA as well. Victim or witness protection does not fall under the police, but it is something where I think better collaboration can do quite a bit. And it's yet another part where the responsibility of policing and witness protection can potentially be devolved. It is an opportunity to strengthen the cooperation between, for example, metro police units across the country, provincial governments, police oversight and community safety ministries, to see what we can do in order to incorporate those different structures to protect people, to support victims and those that report the relevant information. Before I hand over to my colleague, Diane Kohler-Barnard, I want to use the example of what the City of Cape Town did. In October 2023, the city launched an anti-extortion campaign under the slogan, "Enough is enough." And with that, they established a 24-hour hotline and a adequate reward system to actually encourage people and residents to assist the city and other authorities in combating extortion. Now, I think if we get to this point, it now questions what happens next. So what the city then did, they commissioned a new facility protection officer law enforcement unit. And this basically meant that there would be a static but also a mobile response that can immediately support the relevant properties or persons that report these types of issues. Before I continue with the rest, I'm going to hand over to Diane Kohler-Barnard. And with the introduction, I must say, specifically regarding the construction mafia, I think Diane will give the best overview of where all of this started, because extortion is not new in South Africa. And she was one of the people that many years ago already warned that this would snowball into what it is today. And it's as though it fell on deaf ears. And unfortunately, I like to believe that it was deliberately ignored because many people in senior positions were unfortunately involved in extortion. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, quickly. So we'll just go quickly into the report. Really interesting solutions are actually dished out from the DA, and I think it's really important that at least one part in the GNU, we had a systematic sort of like vision to end extortion in South Africa. It's really impressive and really encouraging for the people of South Africa. But anyway, I saw this really interesting report. I think it's on. This is the first time I actually come across this website. I think it's Vir Week Blood. All right, it actually argues that Zama Zamas are actually now involved in grain theft. All right, so it says that there's just a short background. It says the whole idea basically anyway is the fact that Zama Zamas are now shifting their paramilitary corporate culture from mining to farming. You see, and this farming now, rather than mining, what they do on the farms now is that they steal grain, all right? And there's a massive industry around that as well, forming probably another new mafia, according to what Peter Grunwald argues, that South Africa is full of mafias in different areas and different industries. So it says that the term Zama Zama comes from Zulu, which means actually to try your luck, all right? We know that, of course. And it says that a significant number of South Africans are involved in these Zama Zamas, but mostly also there are also miners from Lesotho, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and neighboring countries, which actually are characterized by poverty and an acute scarcity of economic opportunity. All right, so that's what really drives the whole Zama Zama circuit, so to speak. It argues that the near collapse of employment in South Africa's mining industry inevitably prompts many to get involved in illegal activity. And if you remember in my last video, I spoke about how it argues that at the origin of employment in the mining industry, South Africa employed up to 500,000 mine workers. But as of 2022, the data showed that only 25,000 were employed. So the drop was really massive. And also, as at that time, it argues that remittances from foreign workers in Lesotho and Mozambique who were working in the mines in South Africa, the remittances they sent home were actually to the tune of, I think, 286% back home to support their poor communities. And by 2002, the data showed that 286% had fallen to 21% thereabouts, you see. And so I think the report called it a remittance shock. It was a massive shock. And so this really impacted a lot of the employed people who were working, who are now descendants of Zama Zamas, and there's no other way they can imagine employment because the skill they have is artisanal mining or small scale mining. So they have to probably end up becoming illegal, and that there's a circuit, a network that actually then drives their employment in the dark way, in a dark kind of like a system where the guys at the top end up living in luxury houses while the Zama Zamas still receive a pittance, so to speak, because of the illegal mining they engage in. So it says that it is important to distinguish between the repressive labor that the Zama Zamas do and the organized network of cartels and syndicates that abuse them to commit economic crimes. So when I or the forensic investigator says that the Zama Zamas are involved in grain robbery, we're actually saying that the crime syndicates involved in the mining industry have shifted their interests to the logistical value chain of the grain industry. And now the armed Zama Zamas only carry out the orders of the syndicates, quite possibly for wages that do not justify the personal risk. So it argues now here now the argument is that the Zama Zamas are actually responding to orders from a syndicate, so to speak. So if South Africa's government simply focuses on the Zama Zamas themselves as armed pirates or probably armed men causing crime in South Africa, they will end up missing the point, because they argue here, this report argues that there's a higher syndicate that then drives the whole circuit around this whole Zama Zama problem in South Africa. So it says that the fact that the Ramaphosa government is actually currently targeting the Zama Zamas, Zama Zama support structures and food supplies in an attempt to make their living conditions unsustainable in the illegal mines increases the risk to such an extent that the syndicate leaders are looking for other vulnerable industries. So in other words, if the ANC strategy or the GNU strategy is to block the illegal miners, to starve them, to smoke them out, you see, as we saw that the minister in the presidency spoke about, that actually would have a feedback cycle whereby the syndicate will simply move away from mining to other industries. And this report argues now that they move to farming, all right? So there's a kind of like a syndicate now involved in stealing grain from farms in South Africa. And I think it will just break it down a little bit. So it says that he spoke to one South African mega farmer and asked him if he knows anything about the fact that the Zama Zamas have moved from mining towards probably the organized crime around grain theft. Grain, they steal grains, all right? He said he himself is a maize farmer and also has a deep footprint in organized agriculture, from goat, in organized agriculture. So he said he wonders if the police might also not be also involved, because recently he said on RSG that the police are so corrupt and untrained that the place should be closed down. He says that one cannot reform the South Africa's police service, SAPS, into a meaningful institutional organ that serves and protects. This is kind of like a critique of SAPS. It says that the police are not only one of the primary sources of weapons to the criminal cartels, but that there's a significant part of the crime statistics that can be attributed to the police's direct and indirect involvement, all right? It says that if a transit robber and I mistakenly ended up at the roadblock where Becky Sele was hanging out when he was still Minister of Police, we would have been equally nervous, because he says that the police cannot be trusted. And this is actually points out to some statistics I found that, the SAPS is actually on an all-time low in a trust indicator. So SAPS in South Africa is so distrusted by the people of South Africa as we speak. And so that's actually a real serious problem. But anyway, the whole issue around this whole Zama Zama thing is that, at the end of the day, okay, let's just quickly go into some brief history. It says that the way the whole Zama Zama thing issue now is happening is that it's mutating. It's moving now from a mining area to the farming area, all right, with the same crime repeating itself. So it says crime in South Africa, crime is not eradicated, but it is mutating, all right? It says when justice strikes one industry, criminal entrepreneurs just move on to another site with less risk. This way of working and pattern of crime is typical when the police intelligence services no longer function properly. And this is the problem with SAPS. And SAPS, as I usually argue, I think the SAPS in South Africa might even need help from the African Union, because it's a really complex space. They're functioning in post-independent South Africa as we speak, with a massive mafia all over the place. And so there's a lot of help with, policing to keep South Africa safe and South Africa citizens really safe. So he argues here that the state can put enough pressure on criminals to move away from one crime category to another, but the problem cannot be solved, especially if the intelligence service and the police is actually inefficient. So the report argues that history offers numerous examples of crimes that have evolved or mutated over time into new forms of illegal activity as a result of social, economic, and technological challenges. So in the argument here that in the 1920s in the US, the production, distribution, and sale of alcohol was prohibited. Now, organized crime groups moved in by establishing a black market for alcohol. Now, when the ban of this trade was then lifted, many of these groups shifted their activities to other illegal markets, such as gambling, drug dealing, and prostitution, and that the structures and the networks created for alcohol smuggling made it possible for this group to just swiftly switch easily. And that's what's going on in South Africa going forward. So finally, anyway, it argues that, you know, if the involvement of Zama Zamas in the grain theft is confirmed, because it's not yet confirmed, it's still alleged, but he's a farmer who argues, this guy here is a farmer who argues, you know, that there's kind of like a mutation, especially now that President Ramaphosa might end up, you know, stifling the ways in which these Zama Zamas operate in the mines, that what happens then is a mutation. What could happen is a mutation whereby the syndicates that actually operate the whole Zama Zama issue in the mines would simply move to another industry, and the next potential industry is the agricultural industry. It says that if that happens, if that move happens, you know, using Ian Cameron's move, which is a boost, using Ian Cameron's word, which is a business move, it says that it puts grain theft in a new orbit of militarized crime, which the police would now have to start slowly training themselves to get used to, all right? So in other words, there might be a kind of like a syndicate or a militarized crime syndicate around illegal grain theft. This is a move from illegal mining to illegal grain theft. It says, furthermore, since most Zama Zamas come from South Africa's neighboring countries, products that are looted on a large scale will necessarily be exported to those countries. And Ian Cameron mentions that he got the impression that the criminal logistics of grain theft are handled by Zimbabweans, all right? So that's according to Ian Cameron anyway. So he argues that like the mafia companies, like the mafia families of Mpumalanga, who illegally mine chrome and export it through the ports of South Africa as part of the formal economy, grain theft takes a transnational dimension. Illegal gold trade from South Africa and Zimbabwe is similarly laundered through the bank accounts of international crime syndicates in Dubai. And you know, the last report I mentioned, they said Dubai and India actually where some of these syndicates actually work from. So it says that the likely militarization and internationalization of a well-known crime, which is grain theft, is disturbing, and that, you know, he asks now, did the same group of entrepreneurs or syndicates move their tentacles from the life-threatening illegal mining industry to a less risky but equally rewarding grain industry? Well-organized rural criminals are already working with the taxi industry to steal grain from farmers. Now, wow, this is really interesting. Now, it is suspected that the Zama Zamas are also involved, just on a much larger scale. So you remember the last video I made where there was a lot of rhetoric around the taxi mafia and Mpumalanga taxis and all that, and that the taxi mafia, this guy now describes how the taxi mafia work. In other words, the taxi industry and probably the taxi mafia and the industry actually work with the guys who steal the grains and are transported through the taxis. And so to add the Zama Zama to that mix now would then end up having a sort of like a militarized, so to speak, character to the whole transport system of grain theft, and that actually wouldn't spell well for South Africans and South Africa going forward. But anyway, this is actually where I'll stop with this video. There's a lot of issues going on in South Africa, especially in terms of the mafia. I don't know how the government is going to deal with that. I don't know how the police intends to deal with that, but I think it's a really complex problem that needs a really careful, systematic plan. And I don't know if President Ramaphosa's regime is probably adept enough to counter this. But this is actually a difficult place to be for both the government and the people of South Africa. So, but we'll keep hoping. There's light at the end of the tunnel. You see, it says a famous quote, and one has to constantly be hopeful, especially for me as an African. I see myself as a native of the African continent, all right? This is a really personal problem also for me, because I really hope to see South Africa, burgeoning, boisterous South Africa. But with this whole issue, this kind of issues in mafias and all that, it's really disheartening. And I really hope that South Africans and South Africa can actually come out of this. But anyway, I don't know. What do you guys think about Ian Cameron's speech here in this video and the research? Share your thoughts in the comments.